Okay. Um, we have one more speaker, Scott Oneto. Scott is a farm advisor in UCC Central Sierra, El Dorado, Almadora, Calaveras, and Tuolumne counties, which I think I just mispronounced all of them. Scott, are you able to share your screen?
I think so. Is that show up on your end, Whitney?
Yes, great, thank you.
And I don't know if you have my video feed. Do you want that on or off?
Oh, it's up to you.
I tried sharing it, but it says the host has it blocked. So I'll leave it as it is. That works. There we go. All right, should be on. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Whitney, for getting us all organized and putting this program together. I also want to give a quick shout out to Gail Perez, who many of you probably know just from registering. But Gail runs our Weed Research and Information Center at UC Davis and is really the person behind the scenes that gets these programs up and going and just provides tons of educational opportunity to our clientele statewide. So thanks again, Gail, for all your support. I'm going to be covering managing invasive grasses on annual rangelands, and I'm going to be trying to cover basically the areas between what Chris just described in Southern California, and then Tom did an amazing job covering the northeast part of the state. So I'm going to work on all of that stuff in between. And so this is basically what we're referring to. This is the annual grasslands of the central part of California. And it kind of all depends on the goals, but I kind of think of this as a plethora of diversity, which is often the desired outcome, whether you're a rancher or if you're a wildlife preserve or whatever the case may be. We're often trying to have a mix of species. Often that is a mix of non-native annual grasses, non-native annual forbs, but it's also often very lucky to have a mix of perennial native grasses and also perennial or native forbs and wildflowers as well. And so that's kind of often what the desired outcome is, depending on wherever you're coming from. But there's a couple of different species that have been mentioned today that often kind of throw a hitch into having that diversity, and that's these two species here, Medusa head and barb goatgrass. And those are the two that I'm going to primarily focus on today. So these two species are also non-native annual grasses. They were introduced from basically the Mediterranean region, came to California and the western states in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and today they are covering millions of acres here in California and across the western states. And to a bigger extent, they're spreading at a pretty alarming rate, especially barb goatgrass in my part of the state, which I'm basically in the Sierra Nevada region from El Dorado County down through Tuolumne County, so just east of Sacramento in the Central Valley. So in terms of their impacts, and the reason I'm focused on these two species today is, a colleague of mine, Guy Kaiser, who's a lead scientist at UC Davis, used this term transformer species. And I don't know if he thought of this word, but it really just does a great job for describing what these two species do here in California in annual rangelands. And basically these two species they just create monocultures. They're very, very competitive, and they are really good at outcompeting all of the other plants. And so some of the other impacts of these two species is that they've been mentioned before, but these are often thought of as unpalatable species. So whether it be livestock or native ungulates, most animals will often avoid these plants if they have other more desirable species to graze on. And some research that's been done in prior years by colleagues have shown that grazing capacity can often be reduced by as much as 80% when you have either of these species. As been shown in previous talks, that these plants have these nasty awns, and that's one of the reasons why animals have a tendency to browse or graze around them. Medusa head often starts forming very high levels of silica as it gets into its later stages of development, also being very unpalatable. So that's another reason why animals have a tendency to stay away from it. And that high silica makes those plants break down at a very, very slow rate. And so that slow decay will often result in these very, very thick thatch layers. I mean, you can see thatch as high as, I've seen it as 3 to 5 inches in places, where you just get this unbelievable thick thatch buildup. And you would think that that would prevent the germination from any plants, but Medusa head in general has this very adapted ability to even germinate through its own thatch. And so it creates this microenvironment that promotes its further spread in these very thatchy systems. And so this is what that looks like across the landscape. So this is that very thick thatch of Medusa head. And so again, you can see why it could be a problem for other annuals or perennials to try to germinate underneath that. But again, Medusa head with that long on is able to penetrate down through that thatch and still germinate and grow. Just a little quick about the biology. This has been covered pretty good by some of the other speakers, but these are winter annuals, so they germinate with the first fall rains. Hopefully all of you are getting some of those first fall rains over the last 24 hours like we are here. And that germination period can extend into the spring. What's unique about these two species is they have a tendency to focus a lot of their initial growth into root development. And by doing that, they, again, have a more competitive advantage than some of the other annuals, but that also allows them to mature a little bit later than some of those other desirable annual grasses. And so what we often see is that, as we get into late spring and into summer, our grasslands of California begin to turn brown. And as you see here, again, mix of, in this picture, of wild oats, and we have ryegrass and some different bromes. But you can see as those annual grasses are turning brown, there's still some green players here in the picture. And these later maturing species often tend to be Medusa head and goat grass. So this is a picture of Medusa head just a little bit closer up. It can often be, again, misidentified because, it often looks like many of the other species that we have in our annual rangelands, like foxtail and others. And so one of the things that is very characteristic are these awns. And so very, very long awns. And unlike many other annual grasses that have long awns, as the seeds drop, you see that the seed head, or the inflorescence or the flowering head, doesn't disarticulate like many of the other plants, meaning it stays all intact like this. So in that thatch layer, if you're unfamiliar with Medusa head, go out and look in right now. There's a great time, and look to see if you have any of these seed head or these flower heads that are intact like this, and that's a really good indicator of Medusa head. And then here is goat grass. This is a barb goat grass. There's a couple of different species of goat grass in California. All of them are bad, but this is just the worst one, at least in terms of the number of acres, and the rate of spread seems to be worse with this one. So this is barb goat grass. Again, very, very long awns. Gets its name from sort of the shape of the inflorescence or the flower. You can see where the seeds are here, where the seeds attach, kind of looks like an outline of a goat's head, and so that's where it gets the name goat grass. Unlike the Medusa head and many other grasses, when the seeds drop out, goat grass is very different. And so the actual whole inflorescence, that whole seed structure, the whole flower structure, basically breaks off at the top of the stem. And so you get these whole entire flower heads that just drop down to the ground. And so just this group of basically seeds that fall to the ground. And so again, in the fall, this time of the year, if you go out and look in your pastures, you might see these whole entire seed heads laying on the ground. And this is a picture I took of a rancher that I was working with. It had a lot of goat grass, and we were trying to figure out exactly how it was getting spread from field to field. And just a quick look underneath his ATV showed this. And so this is just one of the many ways in which we're spreading these weeds around. So before I get into the control strategies, I think it's important to point out, maybe think about why these plants are invading. And I already alluded to the ability of these plants to be highly competitive, both for nutrients, for soil moisture, but they also, again, create that environment in which they're excluding other plants from even germinating. And so that's one of the reasons why, thatch control is so important especially for Medusa head control, is, to try to just get rid of that, that exclosure, that buildup of material that's preventing other plants from germinating. The other thing that I think is really important that we need to think about is, many of these rangelands across the state are used for livestock grazing. And if you think about how our systems are set up, we often have very, very large pastures with low grazing pressure. And because these plants are non-palatable, that basically allows the animals to graze for the highest and most delicious food. And so, they are grazing around these invasive plants and basically selecting for these plants. So, they're eating all of the desirable stuff, allowing both the Medusa head and goat grass to basically flower and make new seed. And so we're actually propagating and selecting these plants just by the sheer fact of what our current grazing systems often are set up as. Low grazing pressure, and animals can go around and just choose the most nutritious and often the best tasting plants in the pastures. And then also the timing is something we need to think about. So again, these are later maturing species, and in many areas, it could be, so again, as the more desirable grasses have been fed down, they start turning brown, the nutrient value of those start dropping off very quickly. It's not uncommon for many livestock producers to then pull those animals off just as these two species are starting to flower and mature. They'll pull their animals off and either ship them to irrigated pasture, or they may have allotments up in the U.S. Forest Service where they then take their animals up into the mountains for summer grazing. And so, again, kind of selectively selecting for these two species by just pulling the animals off just at the time when grazing would be so important for trying to prevent those plants from going to seed. So a lot of these control strategies have been mentioned by some of the other previous speakers, and so I'll just hit on some of them and maybe focus on some of the parts that haven't been talked about. And so, when it comes to controlling and managing these annuals, of course, as been stated, we want to prevent seed production. And then we want to work on that seed bank. And so, luckily we've got fairly short-lived seeds that we're dealing with. Medusa head, it pretty much requires annual seed development for it to persist. It has a very, very short-lived seed in the soil. Often 1 year, sometimes 2 years, maybe you'll get a few more that last longer than that, but it really does require annual seed production to persist. Barb, the goat grass, is a little bit longer. It's got a bigger seed, and so it can persist 2 to 3 years, and sometimes even longer than that. But usually breaking that cycle for 2 to 3 years can give you pretty good control. And then we want to do some monitoring, as was mentioned by Chris and other speakers, and then really focusing on small satellite populations at first, and then trying to attack some of those larger populations. So because our focus today is on burning, I wanted to start some of the control strategies with burning. This is a VMP, a vegetation management program burn conducted by CAL FIRE that I was a part of this summer that was focused on yellow star thistle and also for Medusa head And so, so this was a fairly large burn. Again, the timing, as Davey pointed out, is super critical. You want to do it just as those desirable annuals have set seed and drop those seeds to the soil surface, and then you use that brown material as the fuel source to carry that fire through these later maturing species. So, you know, yellow star thistle, Medusa head, goatgrass, all of these 3 species have a tendency to mature later than all of the other desirable forage species. And so we can use that timing as to be able to do a selective treatment. So when it comes to burning, you know, I kind of see 2 different windows. The first being the one that was just shown and the one that was described by Davey and others about, you know, kind of this late spring, early summer burn, where we're timing the burn before our weeds have fully flowered and made seed, but after all of the desirables have flowered and set seed, and using them as the fuel source. So usually this is, you know, depends on the part of the state, but could be anywhere from, you know, late April into June, and sometimes even into July. Kind of all just depends on, you know, what part of the state and the year and how those plants are maturing. Of course, you need adequate fuel to carry that fire. If you don't have, I mean, if you have nothing but a full stand of Medusa head or goatgrass or yellow star thistle, and you don't have any brown material or thatch to carry that fire, you're going to get a very patchy burn and really get poor control that year. If the fire is too late, which sometimes I see, you're really, you know, you're not doing much for preventing seed production for that year. Often those seeds, you know, if you're doing a burn in August or September, or, you know, you look at some of the wildfires that we have that have tendency to be later in the season, the seeds have already been set, right? So you already had seed production, they dropped to the ground. So sure, you might be getting rid of some of just the vegetation and you know, releasing some of those nutrients that, again, might promote the germination, like Davey pointed out, which could be a good thing. But then you just want to make sure you can come in and do a follow-up treatment. Another part of burning that I am kind of interested in, and I think there might be some folks on today that are from East Bay Municipal Utility District, but this is something that they I saw them do a number of years ago, and there's really not a whole lot of research in this sort of timing window yet, but I'm very intrigued about wanting to pursue this more. And this is what I call a late fall or early winter burn. And this is targeted at some of these annuals like Medusa head and goatgrass that can have a tendency to germinate right away with the first fall rains. And if you have tons of thatch, you know, think of that 4 inches of thatch of Medusa head, and underneath that thatch, after the first fall rain, you start getting the germination of Medusa head. If we have the perfect opportunity, you know, if we get a dry spell like in November, maybe in December, you know, where we have maybe a week or 2 of dry weather, that thatch dries out, and you have those newly germinated plants down there, that might be an opportunity to run a very, you know, low risk fire through that thatch. And it doesn't need to be a very hot fire because we're just trying to kill little 2-3 inch newly germinated plants. And so again, not really any research to be able to point to at this point, but it's something that I'm kind of interested in looking at a bit more. In terms of burning considerations, I think a lot of this has already been alluded to by the earlier speakers, so I won't really spend too much time on this slide. But really, you know, following up after a burn is really, really important. Sometimes reseeding, again, depending on what your goals are, depending on what the seed bank is, what that seed bank is consisting of, and, you know, what kind of a strategy you might want to come in with after a burn. Sometimes it can be extremely difficult to do a burn 2 years in a row because, again, we need some type of material, whether it be thatch or you know, dead desirable forage grasses to carry that fire. And, you know, if you have nothing but, say, yellow star thistle, you do a burn, you know, often, as Davey said, you get a lot of germination of yellow star thistle the second year. And if that's all you have is yellow star thistle, it'd be tough to run a burn through that patch in year 2. So often doing some other control strategy might be needed. A couple of other control strategies I just want to throw out there for consideration. Mowing can be effective. This is kind of more, I would consider, a smaller scale strategy. You know, if you have small patches or just a small pasture where you see medusa head or goat grass starting to come in. Again, goal is to prevent seed production. So we want to time this just as those plants are starting to get into early flowering. You know, this is late in the season, lots of brown grass out there, high risk for starting fires with mowing equipment. You can be super careful. You know, I've started a fire from, you know, mowing for weed control this time in this sort of situation. So you just have to be super, super careful and know your environment, know what's out there, and use the right piece of equipment. Again, mowing super low, so you want to try to get that grass down as low as you can, 1 to 2 inches. And you're doing it as late as possible because you want to have that plant as stressed as, you know, as drought stressed as possible, so it doesn't have the resources to be able to regrow. If you mow too early, you're pretty much just shooting yourself in the foot. The plants are going to recover. If you mow too late, the seeds have already been produced. And as I mentioned, beware of fire. There are some great success stories out there. Both State Parks in Nevada County has done some really interesting work with mowing. And also this picture is from Creekside Center for Earth Observation that has done some interesting work. This is kind of what that environment looks like just before a burn. So you can see all the desirables have headed out, dropped their seeds, and medusa head in this case is just starting to get into early flowering. Grazing also, it can be an effective tool. This is some work that was done by a colleague, Morgan Duran, several years ago, looking at sheep grazing on medusa head. And he basically did 3 different timings: early spring, a combination of early and late spring, and just late spring. And so, as you can see here, this is a graph showing medusa head cover, and the late spring by itself was by far the best at, again, preventing medusa head from being able to regrow that year and make seed. So grazing can certainly be an effective strategy. You want to do high intensity, short duration grazing, and you want to, again, have lots and lots of animal units per acre. And that's just one of the reasons why we, you know, see so much medusa head and goat grass, is we often just can't get that high intensity grazing unless you're doing it as a prescription and breaking those pastures up into smaller scale. The picture at the bottom here just shows some supplement tubs that can be used in patches of medusa head or bark goat grass to try to increase utilization around certain areas. So that certainly can also be an option as well. So just a few things on chemicals. This has already been covered a little bit by some of the other speakers. This is a ranch that I was working on a few years ago that had nothing but barbed goat grass. And so this was just after treatment. They everything green here is barbed goat grass that they missed, but they basically treated barbed goat grass with glyphosate as a post-emergent just during the flowering stage. So all, you know, if there was anything desirable out there, it already would have set seed and died. And so glyphosate can be used as a selective treatment when you use it late in the season. Aminopyrrolid, which is a milestone, can be used for medusa head control. This is some work that Guy Kaiser did. So the plot on the right is some Italian ryegrass that came in just spontaneously after milestone treatment, and then on the left here you can see nothing but medusa head. So we've got some really good handouts that have the prescriptions and what the rates of some of these. Aminocyclopyrachlor is the last herbicide I'll mention. This is another broadleaf herbicide that can be used for, again, some of these grasses. And so it can be effective for medusa head, both as a pre-emergent as well as a post-emergent application, either fall or spring. And then for barbed goat grass, it also has been effective. And Guy Kaiser, again, did some really good work showing that 4 ounces of aminocyclopyrachlor as a single treatment, either applying it pre-emergently in the fall or in the winter or even in the spring can be effective at reducing barbed goat grass. But he got the best results when he actually split that 4-ounce treatment into 2 ounces in the fall and 2 ounces in the winter. He got amazing control. So there are some effective tools for management of both of these species. Got to think about timing and definitely monitoring, and then definitely look out for new populations. So with that, there's lots of great resources out there. These slides will be made available to folks, and so you can refer back to any of the slides or the publications that are mentioned here. So thank you so much, and I'll take any questions if there's time, Whitney.
Thank you, Scott. We do have a bit of time. We've got one question, and then I'll go ahead and launch the poll. So first question is, Scott, can you discuss the use of remote sensing in detecting these species and how it might be used in early detection?
Oh my gosh, I love that question. Yeah, so I think there is lots and lots of potential there. I actually just got a drone myself. This is a project that I'm going to be working on, hopefully starting this next year, looking at using drones for detecting incipient or small weed populations. And so the tools are already out there. It's just a matter of figuring out the signature for some of these weeds, especially these things that have unique phenologies where they mature super late. Maybe they've got bright yellow flowers when nothing else is flowering. All of those kinds of things we can use for remote sensing. So, even if you don't have a drone, we can use the amazing satellite imagery that's available to hopefully detect some of these weeds. So, I think with technology, we're going to be able to use so much more here in the coming years to use it as a tool for weed control.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and launch the poll, and then there's a couple other questions that we'll answer maybe after we do the poll. Okay, so we're going to launch it. Okay, everyone should be able to see and vote. Okay, a couple more seconds here, and then we'll let Scott adjust the answers. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Okay, Scott, if you want to take a look here at people's responses.
Great. So question number 1, grazing can be effective at controlling medusa head when done at the right time and intensity. Looks like everybody's spot on. That is true. Number 2, what method or methods can be used as effective at controlling medusa head and bark goat grass? And we had, looks like everybody chose, pretty much everybody said both grazing livestock with high intensity and burning to prevent medusa head and bark goat grass from setting seed. That was perfect. And number 3, aminopyrrolid, a broadleaf herbicide, can be used to control medusa head. True or false? And that is true. It can be used both pre-emergent in the fall before germination at high rates, typically between 12 and 14 ounces per acre, or you can use it as a post-emergent product. So just as medusa head is beginning to flower, you can actually use very low rates between 3 and 5 ounces per acre and it doesn't kill the plant, but it does cause seed sterility. So the plants basically produce infertile seeds. So that is true. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we've got, I think if the speakers are willing to stick around for a few moments to answer some questions, we can answer questions. Please put them in the Q&A, and then speakers, if you can address them live, that would be great. I'm going to go ahead and share the instructions for for your credits as well. So if you're getting CCU credits or CCA credits, there's the code for the QR code. And that will also be sent out via email afterwards. Oops. And thank you all for attending, and we're here for a few more minutes if anyone would like to pose any questions. Scott, did you answer the question already in the chat, it looks like? Or
yes. So Joy, if you're still on, I think I brought my slide back up, so hopefully you saw it. And yeah, if you're interested in, and same with Tristan, if you're interested in more information on remote sensing, if you want to reach out to me offline by email, my email address, I'll put it here in the chat. And just feel free to reach out to me, and I can send you some more information on what I know, although it's very limited at the moment. It's something that I'm interested in and wanting to learn more. So definitely look forward to chatting more.
Okay, well, if no one has any more questions, we will let everyone go, but we'll stick around for a few minutes for any additional questions. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for attending today. We appreciate everyone's patience with us for some of the technical difficulties, and we'll hopefully see you again. Thank you. Okay, I'm not sure if Debbie's here again, but there's a question about being able to hire a burn boss. Can you recommend how to find a burn boss to hire? Maybe if anyone else is able to answer that question. I think Debbie's not still here. Any of our other speakers know the answer to that? How do you find a burn boss?
Yeah, I think, so this is Scott. So I think they, I want to say that they register possibly with CAL FIRE. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of shooting from the hip here. But I guess maybe the best thing to do would be to reach out to some of our fire advisors in the state. So if you send an email to Lenya or possibly Jeffrey Stackhouse, or here in my part of the state, Susie Coker is our forester, and I know she does. She's doing a lot with prescribed fire, and she does a lot with burn bosses on her projects. And so if you need me to get you in contact with any of them, reach out to me offline, and I can send you their email and contact information.
Thank you, Scott. And we've got one question about will we be able to see the questions and answers later? And I think Gail and I could make that happen. So yes. Another question, a little new to this. Every time I have talked about prescribed burning in general, a lot of people mention it's not possible in California, but seen in this presentation, it's being used all over the state. Is it just due to costs, permits, different restrictions? So any panelist.
I can take it if nobody else will. I think it's really varied, and it's varied depending on air quality, right? If you can get the permit, and depending on what the other fires in your area are at the moment and things like that. And then a lot of the burns that I know folks are using are training burns for either local firefighters or CAL FIRE. And so it depends on right? Certain years when they all get called to, right, an actual fire, you lose your burn crew. So it's not an easy thing to do reliably, right? But it certainly happens often, but you have to kind of hope for the right conditions for it to happen.
I'll add that I put in a response to one of the earlier questions that there is a growing resource, and I'll put it in the chat as well, that's calpba.org, and it can help you connect with local people who are working to do more prescribed burns. And there are more and more kind of every month across the state. So it's really exciting to see it spreading.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo that there are lots and lots of these prescribed burn associations starting to get formed throughout the state, and you know, it's really just going to be kind of dependent on the area, but you know, it seems like there's lots of interest by landowners and land managers to bring burning back as a tool, because we've kind of shunned away from it for so long. But now I think a lot of people are seeing that burning needs to be reintroduced as a tool for land management.
So I'll add that in Southern California, like I talked about, it's difficult to get prescribed fire on the landscape, partly due because of air quality restrictions and pollution. So while it is possible, there's often just a really small window to get it done. And oftentimes we are lacking in people, in basically foresters who have that burn experience. A lot of them are employed in the northern parts of the state. So we just don't have as much like literal people to help with fires. But it does happen. There are land managers who do burn regularly in Southern California, and there are prescribed fires. They just tend to be small, and they tend to be, you know, every couple of years or so. So it does happen. It just does often take in Southern California, I think, more work than in other parts of the state to get over those humps of limited people and air quality restrictions.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A, so we'll let everybody go. I want to say thank you again to all of our speakers, and thank you to everyone that attended, and thank you to Gail and the Weed Rec again for organizing this. So thank you. We'll hopefully see you all again.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks.